Corporate evenings always have a strange quiet under their shine. Even with the sound of glasses clinking and executives laughing too loudly at things they don't really hear, I can usually sense the fault lines beneath the room. But nothing prepared me for the moment Melissa leaned toward me. Her voice steady in a way that made the truth feel heavier. The ballroom lights reflected off her dress, soft gold shifting like a calm surface hiding deeper water. Around us, the orchestra rehearsed some bright, triumphant melody, as if the night wanted to pretend it was built for celebration. Yet my daughter spoke with the quiet cadence of someone who had already grieved something that wasn't supposed to die. She told me Patrick, her brother-in-law, her sister's husband, a man who played golf with executives and spoke about leadership like it was a sermon, had not only fired her that morning, but had been preparing the ground for months. He hadn't raised his voice, she said. He didn't need to. He used the kind of precision cruelty that passes easily through HR departments and company memos. He erased her piece by piece under the guise of mentorship. She described how he rewrote her performance reviews, removed her name from client proposals, and spoke to senior staff in a tone that suggested she had somehow slipped beneath her own abilities. She told me he enjoyed the performance, the quiet demolition of another person's confidence. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't restructuring. It was ego with a badge. I listened, the wine in my glass untouched, the room suddenly feeling too warm. Melissa wasn't crying. No tremor in her voice. No bitterness. Only the kind of calm that comes after shock wears off and leaves a hollow, steady awareness behind. Acceptance, or maybe exhaustion. Music rose across the ballroom as the CEO lifted a toast. Cameras flashed. Someone nearby laughed so loudly the chandeliers rattled. None of them knew my daughter was explaining how her brother-in-law had turned her workplace into a silent gauntlet, how he had belittled her in meetings, planted doubts in rooms she never entered, and finally dismissed her with a thin smile and a stack of falsified documentation. She said it all quietly, as though she were reporting the weather, and I felt something colder settle in my chest. Not anger, not outrage, just a stillness, old and familiar. A part of myself I thought I'd left behind years ago when I walked out of federal service and tried to build a quieter life. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple, measured movement. I dialed a number I hadn't used in years, one that still lived in the back of my mind like a dormant instrument waiting to be played again. The call went through on the first ring. Across the ballroom, Patrick stood near the stage, laughing easily, unaware that Melissa had finally spoken the truth aloud, unaware that by the time the evening ended, the gears of something much larger, and far less forgiving, were already beginning to turn. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Looking back, I should have seen the signs long before that corporate evening. They were small at first, the kind of quiet disturbances a parent notices only when the house finally falls silent and memory arranges the pieces in order. Melissa had always carried herself with a kind of steady competence. Never loud, never boastful, just precise and thoughtful in the way serious people move through the world. She never asked for attention, and in most rooms that humility worked in her favor. But humility becomes a liability in the wrong company, especially under someone like Patrick. Before the firing, she tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. She arrived at Sunday dinners with a polite smile, carefully arranged but thinner than it used to be. She would help me slice vegetables or wash dishes, talking about her week in a tone so even it almost sounded rehearsed. Her son tugged at her sleeve asking for help with math problems, and she always obliged with patience, though her eyes carried a distant weight, the kind of heaviness born not from exhaustion, but from feeling unseen. I remember one evening in particular, maybe 3 months before she told me the truth. She stayed after dinner longer than usual, sitting at the kitchen island long after everyone else had gone home. She wasn't crying. Melissa was never one to break visibly. Instead, she stared at her laptop as though the document on the screen was accusing her of something she couldn't defend. I offered her tea. She nodded, grateful. But her gratitude had an absent quality, like someone thanking a stranger for holding a door open while their mind was trapped elsewhere. She mentioned restructuring that night. A reorganization after the merger, she said. New leadership philosophies, new project flow, new standards. The kind of language people use not because it explains anything, but because it gives them temporary shelter from the truth. Patrick had recently been promoted to vice president after Hartman Holdings absorbed the smaller firm where he had clawed his way up. Titles change people. Sometimes the change is subtle. Sometimes it's a sudden extraction of whatever decency was only held in place by previous limitations. Patrick treated the promotion as validation that he was untouchable. A man who had married into our family, admired by my older daughter for his ambition, now carried the new title as though it sanctified his worst inclinations. Melissa never said his name directly when she spoke about the strain at work. She talked instead about leadership shifts, new expectations, alignment strategies. But I watched her posture tighten each time her sister mentioned Patrick casually over dinner. A comment about him joining the board of a nonprofit. A joke about his long hours. A remark about how demanding his position was. My older daughter didn't see the tension. She was too close to him, too eager to believe she'd married a man of stature. But Melissa, her silence said more than any explanation could. Signs accumulated. She would check her phone repeatedly during meals, not for messages from friends, but for emails she dreaded receiving. She avoided discussing her projects, which was unusual because she used to talk about them with quiet pride. There were no more stories about client breakthroughs or successful presentations. Instead, she spoke of uncertainty, of needing to reestablish trust, as if her entire history of competence had evaporated overnight. Then there were the cancellations. Meetings removed from her calendar without explanation. Travel requests denied because budgets were tight, though Patrick approved them for others. Her largest account, the one she had shepherded for nearly 3 years, was reassigned to someone with half her experience. When she asked why, Patrick told her it was a development opportunity for the junior associate. He said it with the tone of a teacher correcting a child. Loneliness is a strange thing within a family. It takes on a different texture, quieter, sharper, not caused by absence but by the presence of people who choose not to see. Melissa still attended family events, but over time she seemed to fold inward, as though trying to make herself smaller. She didn't laugh as easily. She no longer hummed while cooking breakfast for her son, a habit she'd had since college, one she'd never even noticed. Even her boy asked me once why mommy was so quiet lately. Children feel these things long before adults admit them. Patrick's behavior extended beyond the office. When he visited Melissa's home, he made subtle displays of dominance, arriving late without apology, speaking loudly about his successes, ignoring Melissa's opinions during group discussions, treating her as though she were somehow intellectually beneath him. He never insulted her outright. His dismissals were practiced, almost polite, a slow erosion rather than a storm. I remained silent through most of it, not because I agreed with his behavior, but because confrontation at the wrong time is like lighting a match in a room filled with invisible gas. Melissa was fragile in a way she didn't show, and I knew that my interference would only drive the cruelty deeper underground. But silence is not the same as inaction. I observed. I listened. I waited for the moment when the facts would align clearly enough that stepping forward would no longer harm her. That moment was coming. I could sense it. And as Melissa grew quieter, the distance between her truth and the facade she tried to maintain grew wider. She walked through her days like someone moving through a slow, persistent storm, one she refused to acknowledge for fear that saying it aloud would make it worse. I saw the storm long before she ever named it, and I knew, with a familiarity I hoped I'd never need again, that if Patrick kept pressing her down with that calm, corporate malice of his, he would eventually force me out of the quiet life I had built, a life I preferred, a life I had earned. But harm done to my daughter, concealed under titles and jargon, is the kind of harm that wakes a part of a man he doesn't often use. And once awakened, that part of me does not return to sleep easily. The morning Melissa was fired, Boise sat under a pale winter sky that made everything look colder than it was. She walked across the parking lot carrying a cardboard box. 8 years of her working life reduced to a few personal items resting on her palms. Her evaluations, old awards, photos of her son, even a small desk plant she tended without thinking. She said her hands shook only once, when she closed the door of her car and finally allowed herself to exhale. The termination meeting had been performed with the kind of quiet cruelty that hides easily behind procedure. Patrick sat across from her, shoulders relaxed, voice smooth, as if he were discussing quarterly numbers instead of her livelihood. An HR representative occupied the other seat, nodding blandly as Patrick listed vague efficiency concerns and inconsistent leadership alignment. None of it matched her record. Before he became vice president, Melissa had never received anything but praise. But power changes the tone of truth. It bends it to the shape of the one holding the pen. Melissa didn't argue. She told me later that she could feel the trap had already closed. Every argument she might raise would be used to justify the decision rather than reconsider it. Even so, something in her insisted on witnessing the moment clearly. She placed her phone inside her purse, screen facing outward, recording every word. Not because she intended to fight, she hadn't yet reached that point, but because she needed proof that the violence done to her dignity hadn't been imagined. Patrick ended the meeting with a smile, a gesture he probably practiced in mirrors. He reminded her to remain grateful for the generous severance, considering her declining value. That phrase struck her harder than the loss of her job. To be diminished by a stranger is one thing. To be diminished by family, wrapped in professionalism, is another kind of wound entirely. She drove home without speaking to anyone, placed the box on her kitchen table, and sat beside it in silence. When she finally forwarded me the email Patrick sent an hour after the termination, I felt something cold settle inside me. His message was polished, smug, offering her an opportunity to reflect on performance issues. He wrote as though he were granting her a favor, not erasing her career. The tone was controlled, but the pleasure threaded through it was unmistakable. When Melissa played me the recording later that evening, I listened alone in my den. The lamp beside me flickered softly. The rest of the room stayed dark. Patrick's voice came through the speaker with calm confidence, instructing her on humility, implying she had overestimated her abilities, dismissing her entire history of work as legacy performance irrelevant to current expectations. The HR representative said almost nothing, which in some ways was its own confirmation. Silence often reveals guilt more clearly than argument. I replayed the recording twice, then let the room grow quiet again. I've spent years of my life studying the structure of retaliation, how it hides behind updated frameworks, how it disguises itself as leadership. Patrick followed every pattern. Isolate the target, rewrite the narrative, build a paper trail designed to outlast the truth. He did it with ease, likely believing he operated beyond consequence. But when harm reaches my daughter, something in me aligns with absolute clarity. Not anger, anger clouds judgment. What rises in me is steadiness. A slow, controlled certainty that someone has stepped beyond the boundary where patience can still serve. I didn't tell Melissa what I felt. She needed rest, not strategy. But as she sat across from me, shoulders hunched in quiet disbelief, I understood this moment was not an end. It was the first undeniable proof of the pattern I had suspected for months. And by the time the sun began rising over the frozen rooftops, I knew what needed to be done. I knew which old skills I would have to retrieve, and which doors I could still open with a single call. Patrick believed he had acted in private. He was about to learn how quickly privacy dissolves when truth finally has a witness. I have learned over the years that real power rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, like groundwater beneath a city. Unseen, steady, shaping the foundations while the buildings above pretend to stand on their own. When Melissa told me everything, I didn't react with anger or threats. I simply felt the familiar shift inside, the one that meant patience would now serve a purpose. I didn't confront Patrick. Men like him thrive on emotional reactions. They mistake noise for weakness and silence for surrender. Instead, I spent the evening reviewing what Melissa had saved. The email, the recording, her older evaluations, the messages where meetings disappeared from her calendar without explanation. She didn't realize what she had compiled, but I did. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat down at my desk, and took a breath I hadn't taken in years. There is a way the body remembers old roles. The posture returns first, then the clarity, then the instinct to examine every detail until the truth forms a structure no one can deny. Before retirement, I worked in federal compliance oversight. Not glamorous work, but quiet, precise, and deeply unforgiving to those who abused authority. Over time, I learned that most retaliation is not bold. It lives in shadows. Minor write-ups, shifts in responsibility, slow erosion disguised as policy. Patrick followed every step from the old playbook, and he did it with the arrogance of someone certain he would never be questioned. So I made a call, not to a lawyer, not to a friend looking for gossip, but to a former colleague in Washington, someone who had seen more misuse of power than most people realize exists. I didn't dramatize the situation. I simply stated the facts. An employee with a clean record, a sudden shift after a family-connected promotion, manufactured evaluations, retaliatory behavior, and a termination built on falsified justification. My colleague listened. Then he asked for documents. I sent everything Melissa had provided, including a detailed summary of the pattern she endured. When I clicked send, I felt the first true movement toward resolution. Not victory, victory is a noisy word, but correction. Quiet, precise correction. Within a week, investigators opened a confidential review into Hartman Holdings. These reviews don't arrive with warning shots. They arrive with formal letters, requests for internal communication logs, meeting transcripts, isolated interviews with staff who suddenly remember details they thought were unimportant. They arrive like winter storms. Silently at first, then unmistakably, and finally with a weight no one can ignore. I didn't tell Melissa. She needed space to breathe, to remember who she was outside Patrick's shadow. She spent those days sending out resumes, questioning her worth, trying to make sense of a situation that had never been about competence. She believed she had failed. She didn't yet understand that certain failures are engineered by people who fear the strength they pretend not to see. We had dinner together that Sunday. She sat at my table, quiet, thoughtful, her son drawing pictures beside us. He hummed softly. Melissa no longer did. She asked how my week had been. I told her it was uneventful. She didn't need to carry the weight of the investigation. That was mine for now. Meanwhile, Patrick carried on as though nothing had shifted beneath him. He sent out memos in his usual polished tone, scheduled leadership meetings, boasted to senior staff about maintaining high standards. He didn't know that federal auditors were already tracing the threads he had pulled, listening to the stories of employees who, once asked, spoke freely about his sudden appetite for control. The review expanded quietly. Retaliation claims, inconsistencies in his assessments, a pattern of targeting those he saw as threats. The email he sent Melissa, so carelessly arrogant, was flagged immediately. The recording she made became more than a personal keepsake. It became a documented example of abuse of authority. The storm gathered without sound, without warning, without a raised voice. I spent each evening as I always had, watering my plants, preparing simple meals, reading case studies out of habit. From the outside, nothing about my life changed. But internally, a part of me I thought I had buried long ago had returned. Steady, patient, and utterly unmoved by intimidation. I didn't celebrate the progress. I didn't even feel satisfaction. What I felt was alignment. The sense that something tilted off balance had begun to right itself. That an injustice carried out in polished boardrooms and polite emails was now being examined under a light Patrick could not dim. When my colleague called to confirm that the review had expanded to include supervisory conduct violations, I thanked him quietly. No triumph, no speeches, just the knowledge that the process had begun, and that Patrick, for the first time, was standing in a room where his title could not protect him. Justice does not rush. It moves at the pace required to leave nothing undone. And now that it had begun, it would not stop. 6 weeks passed before anything surfaced, though the silence itself was movement. Investigations, when done properly, do not arrive with sound or spectacle. They move through corridors where authority once felt untouchable, opening doors people assumed were locked, quietly gathering facts that no memo can disguise. I lived my life as usual: morning walks, small errands, evenings spent in a quiet kitchen. But beneath the routine, I could feel the slow tightening of inevitability. The first sign came in the form of a pale envelope on Melissa's doorstep, a notice of a scheduled labor hearing. She held it with both hands when she told me about it, her voice steady but fragile. She still believed she would walk into a room designed to dismiss her. She didn't understand that the ground had already shifted. The hearing took place in a neutral government office, a windowless boardroom with stainless steel water pitchers and legal pads placed with military precision. It wasn't dramatic. Justice rarely is. People imagine courtroom battles, raised voices, revelations that shake the walls. But the truth, when it finally rises, does so quietly, simply, with the confidence of something that no longer needs to argue for itself. Patrick arrived in a navy suit, immaculate as always, flanked by two lawyers who carried the kind of polished certainty that comes from believing the system bends toward hierarchy. He avoided looking at Melissa, but he glanced at me briefly, quickly, as if testing whether I belonged in the room. He didn't know yet. He would. The panel asked for opening statements. Patrick's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of necessary restructuring, documented performance issues, objective leadership decisions. He spoke smoothly, professionally, as though reading from a script he had used many times before. But confidence built on fabrication has a short lifespan. When the panel requested evidence, Patrick handed over curated documents, modified timelines, selective comments, cleaned up explanations. Then, one of the investigators asked for the full performance archive, the original files unaltered. Patrick's posture changed almost imperceptibly. That was the first fracture. They played the recording next. Melissa kept her eyes on the table as Patrick's voice filled the room. The condescension, the clipped dismissals, the strategic undermining. Every phrase designed to reduce her overestimated abilities, necessary humility, declining value. He had spoken those words believing they would remain buried. Hearing them played aloud stripped away the safety of pretense. The room grew still. Even Patrick's lawyers looked momentarily unsettled. The panel asked him to explain the tone. He tried. He blamed stress, restructuring pressures, misunderstandings. But explanations collapsed quickly when held against their own evidence. Then came the email, the one he had sent Melissa after firing her. The phrases he thought carefully crafted now sounded like admissions of intent. The panel asked him to justify calling her severance generous considering her declining value. He attempted to reframe it as encouragement, but the words resisted him. By the time questions turned to retaliation, his confidence had thinned. They confronted him with inconsistencies in the modified evaluations, missing timestamps, altered language. They asked about the sudden reassignment of Melissa's account to a junior associate with half her tenure. They asked why meeting invitations involving her had been deleted from archives under his credentials. He answered, but truth offers no shade to stand beneath when it begins to burn. When the ruling was read, it was done without ceremony. Hartman Holdings was fined for unlawful termination and retaliation. Patrick was barred from holding supervisory authority in the state for several years. His career, carefully polished, meticulously presented, cracked quietly in that windowless room. Melissa listened with her hands folded, shoulders drawn inward. She didn't celebrate. Relief can sometimes feel as heavy as the burden that preceded it. The panel granted her back pay, damages, and a formal corrective statement to restore her professional record. They issued a recommendation letter from a separate review committee to ensure her reputation remained intact. Patrick stood slowly, as though the weight of consequences had added years to his frame. He didn't look at Melissa. He didn't look at me. Some men cannot face the ruins they create. Afterward, in the parking lot, Melissa hugged me tightly. She whispered, "I never knew you were capable of this." I didn't answer. There was nothing to clarify. I simply held her for a moment, then stepped back. Justice is not about triumph. It is about restoration. And restoration, done quietly, is sometimes the only victory a person needs.